Okay, I think I'll introduce Erika so that we can get started. Thanks, Erika, for agreeing to do a seminar today. It was fun for me to be able to reach out to Erika because she was on both my master's and my PhD committee. So she's a great mentor to me as I was learning to be a scientist. And Erika is a soil scientist in the Department of Geography at UW-Madison. But her work she's going to present today has to do with the structures of being a scientist, if you will, and how that affects people from different groups. So ask her about her soil work in succession and soil carbon and paleosolids later, but today she's going to talk more about this workplace climate issue. So thanks for joining us, Erika.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. So nice to see you. Nice to see some other folks in the room from other aspects of my other stages of my life. Some nice Wisconsin and Berkeley connections. Hey, cool. So yeah, thanks for having me join you. So I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, and everybody can hear me? Okay, volume's good? Great. So truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. The University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I'm joining you from today, occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. The Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory in 1832. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this and all territories. And we acknowledge the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that connect us together today. And we commit to honor and respect the many indigenous peoples still connected to the lands and waters on and from which we gather. And there are several reasons why I now start all of my talks, actually, not just my talks on climate, with a land acknowledgement. And one of those reasons is that as a geographer, as a geoscientist, as a soil scientist, I'm really interested in understanding the processes that are influencing the landscapes, right, that where I do my research. And so really thinking about kind of the human history of those landscapes is also a really important story of where we do our research. As an educator and as a mentor, I need to understand the history of the institutions, right, where I do my work. I need to understand the history of the discipline that I teach, and I need to understand why there are some groups of students who, might feel not very welcome in the spaces that we inhabit in academia. And then a lot of the research that I'm going to be talking about today, specifically thinking about exclusionary behaviors and hostile workplace climates and what we can do to combat those or to overcome those conditions and those workplaces, really highlights the disproportionate impact that a lot of these behaviors have on a lot of different communities. And one of the communities that is especially harmed by these types of behaviors, and that is probably one of the least represented in our scientific disciplines, are Native and Indigenous scientists. And a lot of the work that my particular team started in this area was focused on sexual harassment. And Native and Indigenous girls experience some of the greatest rates of sexual violence in the United States and around the world. So I think it's really important to kind of have, all these contexts of the work that we do, and really thinking about kind of the history at all these different levels. So as Anne mentioned, I am in a geography department at UW-Madison. My research is at the interface of biogeochemistry, biodiversity, and global change. I'd be talking about, thinking about land use change or climate change or other types of disturbance processes and how that affects above and below ground species diversity, interactions between plants and microbes, and how that affects specifically carbon and other types of biogeochemical cycling. But more recently, I've actually started a new research area in my program where a lot of the work that I used to do as part of more advocacy has now actually become a research program. And this is the work that I'm going to be talking about today. I know that I've, kind of collaborated and connected with folks in the room. And I, some years ago, I think it was actually I was trying to think when it was. I think it was actually quite a long time ago. I was up at the University of Minnesota and gave a research talk. And usually I'm talking about secondary succession on tropical landscapes. And that's actually gotten me, through that ecological and biogeochemical research, had become really interested in thinking about legacies of landscapes, legacies of disturbances, legacies of land use history, which actually connects a lot to the work that I'm doing recently. And the last time I was in Minnesota, I was talking about a paleosoil project in Nebraska. And we've continued looking at that work, trying to understand what are some of the historical factors and landscape disturbance factors that have influenced the accumulation of carbon and persistence of carbon in these landscapes, and what is our vulnerability to current and future environmental change. But the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is, really starts with an observation that our STEM workforce does not reflect society. This is some data from the American Geosciences Institute, comparing the percentage of women and men faculty across different geoscience-related departments. And you can see in the blue bars, we have percentage of men faculty, in the red, women, and across all these different subdisciplines of the geosciences and related fields, we say that women, who actually make up 50% of the US adult workforce population, are in most fields nowhere near 50% of faculty. And we actually see this at multiple levels. And at the very bottom, soil science is right there at the bottom. Historically, soil science has actually fared one of the worst potentially within the geosciences as well. We see similar disparities when we look at kind of the student pipeline per se. So this is actually data from a paper that was specifically looking at soil science and diversity in the soil science discipline. And here we're looking at bachelor's degrees earned. And at the top, we've got agricultural sciences and natural resources, earth sciences below that, compared to all science, and then compared to the US population. And the different colors represent different racial and ethnic groups. The light gray represents, the overrepresented group in our disciplines compared to the US population, so white category. And you can see that both the earth sciences and agricultural sciences and natural resources are less diverse than other scientific disciplines. And we see this also as we go higher up in degrees. This is looking at doctoral degrees earned in soil science and related fields. At the top, soil science, followed by agronomy, ecology, geology, compared to all STEM fields. So these disciplines that are my home, that I intersect across all of these three, are some of the least diverse fields in the scientific disciplines. And one of the challenges is that there's been a lot of efforts to try to understand why do we have such low representation, and to increase recruitment and try to increase percentages of different groups in our disciplines. And we're actually seeing that despite tons of efforts in the last couple of decades, and actually, a lot of funding put towards efforts to recruit, is that we're not seeing huge increases in diversity in actually across all disciplines. This is just looking at a snapshot. This is looking at bachelor degrees awarded to African-American students. The different colors represent different disciplines, and we're looking back, data from 1995 to 2017. At the top, computer science, followed by chemistry and biology. You see biology, there's a little bit of an increase. Computer science, in the last 20 years has actually seen a decrease in the representation of African-American students. And we have earth sciences at the very bottom. So, less than 3% of bachelor degrees. And we know that, if we look at PhD degrees, it's going to be, even much lower numbers. So the data shows that we have a long way to go, and we have some persistent trends of disproportionate underrepresentation. And there's been a lot of research trying to understand why, right? Like, where are the biases, where are the points of inflection in kind of, higher education, in academic careers, in STEM careers, in industry that lead to these patterns. And here's kind of a laundry list of different important career milestones or kind of career, gates, right, or kind of important entryways to professional careers where either gender or racial bias, or gender and racial and ethnic bias has been documented. So, in the way that job applications are rated, right? You got the same material, you change the name so that, to names that are more stereotypically associated with one race or another. You change the gender of the name or what are more typically associated with a particular gender, and the same materials are rated differently. There's bias in postdoc reference letters, salaries, right? So resources that scientists have when they start their careers, access to research facilities, referee or speaking invitations, right? So recognition in their field, scientific awards, et cetera, et cetera. And the references in blue are specific to the geosciences. And I actually need to update this with the most recent data that came out about racial bias in NSF awards, also looking at the geosciences directorate. And there's also a disproportionate impact of COVID-19, as we know, on groups that are historically underrepresented in our scientific disciplines. And there's also biases in who ends up doing a lot of this invisible labor or kind of service that is devalued and can take away from kind of, metrics of success as we currently understand them. So there's a lot of bias and discrimination in these processes, but we argue that there's more than just bias. This conversation about bias has contributed to, kind of this model of a leaky pipeline, right? Trying to really, kind of using this model of we've got a pipeline, a career pipeline, and if we want more people in faculty positions, we need to just stuff more people at the beginning of, right? We need to recruit more people, stuff more people into the pipeline, so we get more people out of the pipeline, because along the way, people are going to be dropping out, right? For different reasons. There might be more reasons why some groups drop out than other groups, based on this documented bias and discrimination. And there's many reasons why, the leaky pipeline is not a great metaphor. It's kind of a passive metaphor. It kind of assumes or implies that there's only one way, right? Only one pipeline to get to a place. If you drip out of it, there's no way to get back into the pipeline. And it kind of focuses more attention on like, well, why do people drip out, rather than like, what is wrong with a pipeline that is not equitable? And so our team has been doing a lot of work on really thinking about, what is wrong with the structure, what is wrong with our environments, right? That contribute to people leaving, contribute to people having bad enough experiences that they don't want to stay in our disciplines. And so, we had a piece come out in Nature Geoscience that talked about kind of this hostile obstacle course, right? Recognizing that there's nothing passive about the pipeline, and that we're not going to solve the problem by just stuffing more people at the beginning of the pipeline, but they really have to recognize that the pathways that people have in front of them and the access to different pathways is really different based on people's identity. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is funded by 2 National Science Foundation awards through the ADVANCE program. We're wrapping up the first one. Our main goals were to collect data, which I'll be sharing today, and develop bystander intervention training with discipline-specific scenarios that incorporate intersectionality and kind of the disproportionate impact of people that are at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. And then we recently received a second award to expand the work that we did with the first NSF grant where we're developing a train the trainer certification program and a workplace climate intervention program for academic STEM departments to really think about how do we work together to build inclusive, thriving, and workplace environments. Like all of my research, this has been incredibly collaborative work. So here you can see we have this grant as an advanced grant is unique in that it's not based at one institution. It's actually a partnership award so that we have partnerships with non-academic organizations. So we have partnerships originally with American Geophysical Union, the Association for Women Geoscientists, and the Earth Science Women's Network. And we expanded to include the Geological Society of America, the Soil Science Society of America, and the Ecological Society of America. And then our project is also not just based, I'm the lead PI at Wisconsin, but we have team members across all of these different universities in different parts of the country. We have some minority serving organizations represented, private schools, public schools, land grants, small liberal arts schools. That kind of gives us also a flavor of the different type of academic environments, research intensive academic environments, where, so we can kind of test how well our interventions are working. In the second stage of the grant, we've been, really excited to expand our group of partners. And so we've, added the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, the American Meteorological Society, and then also are partnering with an incredible group of organizations that are mostly led by early career scientists, such as Geo-Latinas, Asian American Pacific Islanders in geosciences, Black geoscientists, Society of Latinos and or Latinx Hispanics in Earth and Space Sciences, and 500 women scientists. So we've got a really good kind of community of people working together on this work. And before I jump into the data, I wanted to point you to our project website. So the ADVANCEGeo Partnership website is hosted by the Science, Education, and Research Center, or CERC, out of Carleton, which you're probably, hopefully familiar, is a kind of a wonderful place, a wonderful hub of educational and training materials across STEM disciplines, but specifically in the geosciences. And we've got a lot of really good information about our project, but these community resources, I think, are incredibly helpful. We've summarized research on, harassment, bullying, discrimination, racism in science, inequities, and, summarize social science research for scientists. And we've also summarized strategies that research teams, academic departments, and organizations can put into place. And we specifically have, one of my favorite pages is the in the field resources page, where we have some really good resources for thinking about inclusivity, accessibility, and safety in the field as well. So if you just Google ADVANCEGeo CERC, you'll be able to find our website. So I'm going to start with a take-home message from our climate survey before we dig into some of the data, and then I want to spend the rest of the talk really thinking about, okay, what, in the context of what we know is happening, what can we do about it? So we found that workplace experiences differ by gender, race, and ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability status, and career stage. And I forgot to mention, we conducted a workplace climate survey through the American Geophysical Union, the Geological Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, Earth Science Women's Network, and Association of Women Geoscientists. So we had 5 professional associations. And, we asked questions about positive, negative workplace environments, just to get a sense of, what is the general climate and how is it affecting different groups. And so this is the first, very comprehensive in terms of the different types of questions that we asked survey of the geosciences that also use validated tools. So we worked with an organizational psychologist to come up with a really comprehensive survey. And we actually ran basically the same survey in the ecological sciences and had that published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment last week, and found very similar findings. So we've got workplace experiences differ by identity. We found that historically excluded groups experience more negative workplace environments and are more likely to report negative career outcomes. We found that historically excluded groups and early career respondents express greater discomfort with prevalence of alcohol in professional settings. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but happy to answer any questions in the later on. And then we recommend the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts need to address hostile behavior effects on careers and retention in the geosciences. That is not enough just to focus on recruitment, but we really need to think about the spaces that we're bringing people in. So I'm going to show you some of the data from the geosciences survey, and we had over 2,000 respondents. And we found that overall, most people were having positive experiences. And we defined workplace as either your learning environment or your working environment, because we included students as well. So we found that more than 70% experienced positive interactions with their peers. This could include someone showing you genuine concern and courtesy, someone noticing when you did your best possible work, someone expressing interest in your work-related opinions, etc. And our survey specifically asked about the last 12 months. And so we're obviously missing kind of career impacts. We're just asking about most recent events. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to get more accurate measures of frequency, right? How often are these things happening? So overall, it seems pretty positive. So you could say, okay, no problem here, we're good to go. But of course, I wouldn't be here to talk to you about this if that were the simple answer. So let's look in a little bit more detail at some of the data. So overall, the majority of people are having positive experiences, but there are still a lot of people who are not having good experiences. We found 37% never or only once or twice in the last 12 months received public recognition for their work. And this is across all respondents, right? Like this is including everybody. I think that number is huge, especially when we think about, science, where, so much of our work and career depends on disseminating our work, right? And kind of having our work being read and cited and incorporated by the scientific community, and our work being recognized. It'd be hard to get tenure if you're not getting recognition for your work. So pretty big numbers. We found that between 1/3 and 40%, and this is across everybody, experience insulting remarks, devaluation of their work, and bullying and intimidation over the last 12 months. I think these are really, really big numbers. So even though we have, more than 70% are having good environments, we have a problem here. And then, of course, if you break it down by different groups, and I'm just going to give you a one-dimensional analysis, recognizing that people, of course, have more than just one identity, but we're just going to start with the one-dimensional analysis. So we found that non-binary respondents and women experience more interpersonal mistreatment than men. So greater devaluation of work efforts, more insulting remarks, more concerns for their physical safety, more bullying. And these categories that I'm showing you are actually kind of groups of other questions. So we had a lot of other questions that we ended up kind of categorizing, based on the literature, but also based on some correspondence of the data into these different categories, just to simplify. And we found that, overall, for most of the questions that we asked, non-binary individuals were experiencing worse environments than women. And in the geosciences, most of the work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, period. And then most of the work on diversity, equity, inclusion focused on gender has focused on women. We've kind of ignored other identities. And so I think this data is really important to recognize that there are people who identify beyond the binary, and that they're not having good times in our discipline. lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, pansexual, and asexual respondents experienced greater interpersonal mistreatment than those who did not identify in those ways. So, greater devaluation of work and efforts, greater percentage of insulting remarks, more concerns for physical safety, bullying, and intimidation. We start seeing a pattern. Geoscientists of color experience greater devaluation of their work and efforts than respondents who identified as white. And then we recognize that, of color is, of course, a huge category that hides a lot of differences, both racial and ethnic differences within that group. So we looked at some smaller categories within that. And so, for example, we found that more than half of Latinx respondents reported devaluation of their work compared to 35% of their white peers. 25% of Black respondents reported fearing for their physical safety in the workplace compared to 11% of white respondents. So we're seeing some disproportionate impacts. We also asked questions about ability. So geoscientists who identify as disabled or with a disability experience more negative workplaces as well. And this was kind of across all the questions that we asked. And then our project actually started, we wrote our proposal in 2016 to work on sexual harassment in the geosciences. And as you can see, our work is much broader than sexual harassment because we recognize that environments that tolerate sexual harassment also tolerate other hostile and exclusionary behaviors. And, sexual harassment is illegal in the United States. We still tolerate it in the workplace. And so there's a lot of other behaviors that are not illegal. Most of the behaviors that I've already showed you, the data that I've showed you, most of these behaviors are not illegal. And most universities don't actually have policies to deal with those behaviors. But we're seeing disproportionate impact, right? And it's a problem that we don't even have policies in place to address them. So we used the Sexual Experiences Questionnaire, which is really comprehensive survey. And we found that overall, 14% of our pool experienced sexual harassment in the past 12 months. But if we look at different groups, there's of course disproportionate impacts. So more than half of non-binary respondents had experienced sexual harassment in the past 12 months, 33% of LGBTQIA, 26% of disabled respondents, etc. And then if we look at the type of sexual harassment, we found that gender harassment was the common denominator of all other forms of sexual harassment. So basically, more than 96% of people who had experienced one form of sexual harassment had also experienced gender harassment. And why is that important? Well, it's important because gender harassment is often not even legally identified as sexual harassment, but the National Academy of Sciences report identified it as equally harmful as what we recognize as sexualized harassment. And because it's not often recognized, but it's still equally harmful and we don't have policies to address it, it kind of falls into that category like, bullying and intimidating behavior, where it actually can lead to really toxic workplaces with very few protections. So something we need to be talking about. And then, of course, as you can imagine, there are consequences to these behaviors. So the way we asked the survey, always live and learn when you write surveys, like every type of research experiment, right? You always have some good ideas on how to do it better the next time. We can't statistically say that, people avoided their colleagues because they experienced this behavior. That the way we set up the survey, we cannot ask that. But we asked in the survey, based on these experiences that we've asked you about, how often have you considered this? And so, we can't statistically, right? We can't say causation, right? But we can look at correlation. So we've got more than 50% of all of our respondents say that, they often avoid their colleagues in the workplace. We've got, more than 30% considered leaving their institution, almost 30% considered career changes. We have avoidance of supervisors, more than a quarter, skipping professional activities, considered leaving the discipline, decline of professional opportunity, or concerns about physical safety in the workplace, right? So all of these, of course, all of these behaviors have health problems, but we also know that they have professional consequences. And there's also disproportionate impact on career consequences. So find 68% of non-binary geoscientists were more likely to consider a career change, followed by 39% of women and 21% of men. Disabled geoscientists were more likely to skip a professional activity. Right? A third considered a career change or leaving the discipline, and basically every group showed similar disproportionate impact. If we looked at different racial and ethnic groups, we have 50% of Black, African American, or African respondents considered leaving their jobs, leaving their institution. But even if we look at majority groups, 38%, right? So these environments are disproportionately harming some people. But, I think the data convincingly shows that we are all harmed by these behaviors, right? And so that it really needs to be kind of a team effort to think about, how do we change our working environment so that everybody can thrive? Okay, so what can we do moving forward? And this is what I want to talk about for the rest of our time, and then open it up for questions and discussion. Is really thinking about, we need to change the culture and the climate at all levels. And so our team with ADVANCEGeo has actually been trying to work at all these different levels. So our work on bystander intervention focuses a lot on what individuals can do, but also thinking about individuals as part of teams and part of communities, which brings us to kind of the level of department as well, where we're, we all need to be accountable, of course, for our behavior, but we all need to be, responsible for holding our peers accountable and for following up and supporting and protecting people who are being harmed by these behaviors, or who are let me rephrase that, who are being targeted by these behaviors, because, I argue that we are all harmed by these behaviors, even if we're not the intentional direct target. We've been doing a lot of work with professional societies. And so that's what's been really nice about our partnership grants, is that we have investment by professional societies, which kind of helps us start to change the culture at the disciplinary level. And, from the outside, start influencing what's happening in our institutions. And then, of course, funding agencies can play a really important role. And we've already seen the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and National Institutes of Health, incorporating some, to different degrees, some accountability measures for thinking about equity, safety, inclusivity in research programs as well. So I want to talk a little bit about more specific actions that can be taken. So the first of all is, the best solution for dealing with the underrepresentation of groups is to recruit, hire, and of course, retain more diverse faculty, staff, and students. This is another figure pretty much showing similar trends, but different colors represent different racial and ethnic groups. And we've got the US population compared to different disciplines. So, disproportionate or underrepresentation across STEM. When we think about retaining, because that's really, what we focus our work more, is not so much on the recruitment, because sometimes we do a more or less job of recruiting. We don't always hire, but we don't do a great job of retaining. So that's what I want to focus on. One of them is really to consider that all of these behaviors that we've talked about, whether they are illegal or not, really contribute to, they contribute to harmful working and learning environments and should be considered unethical. and should be considered as part of research misconduct. And actually, in the past, sexual harassment has been considered part of research misconduct, but formally is not. So, for example, we worked with the American Geophysical Union and helped them rewrite their ethics policy, which was approved in 2017, that defines discrimination, harassment, and bullying as scientific misconduct. So it actually recognizes that, our work as scientists, right, research ethics is not just about data, it's not just about plagiarism, fabrication, right, or mismanagement of funds, but it is about how we treat people. And that we can't keep incentivizing people for being good scientists when they're actually not treating people well. Following that is really, in addition to thinking of this as a research ethics problem, is to think of it as a safety problem, especially when we're thinking about field work. It's really hard to think about field work without thinking about equity and without thinking about inclusivity, because they are, groups in our community of scientists who are disproportionately, kind of more, how do I want to say? I don't want to say vulnerable or risk, because that puts it on them, but just really thinking about, disproportionately harmed by things, or excluded by behaviors that can happen in the field. And of course, if we think about, kind of disabled scientists not having access to the field, or how do we reimagine, our field-based trainings or field-based research so that disabled scientists can participate fully as well. So there's been a lot of effort in the geosciences and the ecological sciences and the natural resources community in the last couple of years. And some of the work that ADVANCEGeo has been doing too is really thinking about field safety, right? That we need, there are some groups of people based on their identity who don't feel safe in different places of the US or of the world where we're doing research. And so how do we address that? That's an important consideration of research safety as well. Following on that is really thinking about how do we reinvent mentoring? How do we move away from this like binary model that, really has the potential for abuses of power, and recognize that that academia and science is very hierarchical. And so how can we build in safeguards to protect those who are most vulnerable from abuses of power? And so National Academy of Sciences came out with a report a couple of years ago about the science of effective mentorship in STEM, and they recommend having teams of mentors to try to get away from this, like students or early career researchers or postdocs being dependent on one person basically for their entire career, right? And so how do we really rethink our relationships with people as well is really what it is at the end of the day. And in order to value, or in order to move this work, to advance this work, we need to value the work that people put into mentoring, into teaching, into building our into making our field sites more accessible, into making our labs and classrooms more accessible and more inclusive. Right now in academia, we don't only not value this work, but we often penalize people for doing this work. And that contributes to that disproportionate impact and underrepresentation, because there are some groups that are, mostly for their own, survival, and because they are community driven, end up doing this work more than others. So really important to think about, we need to incentivize, we need to value, and we need to compensate the caring labor that needs to happen in our departments and in our research teams and in our universities. In order to do this, we need to redefine excellence and professional success, because our current metrics are not really well aligned with everything that we're talking about right now. So we really need to rethink, kind of our STEM structure, and it's a good time to do this. And kind of tying back to the beginning of the talk. I started with a land acknowledgement and kind of communicated why it's important to me to kind of remind myself of the history of the exclusionary history of my university, of where I do my field sites, of my disciplines. And I think that's really important as scientists and educators to kind of recognize, like, what are the legacies of the history of our disciplines, the natural resources, natural resource sciences, soil science, geoscience, right, have very colonial and extractivist legacies. How does that influence the way we do our science, the way that we, might interact with other communities when we go and do field work, how people might feel welcomed or not in our disciplines. It's really important to learn this history. And there have been some really exciting efforts in the geosciences. I wanted to put a shout out to GeoContext. You can also find the resources on CERC that have started to do this for the geosciences and really think about, what are, looking at the history of some of the really important, theories and models and people in our discipline, in some of their not so pleasant history and how we need to recognize that. And so I've been doing some of that work here at UW-Madison, another partnership, another collaboration, this time with historians and education and learning scientists, where we've been kind of digging into, thinking about what can we learn from the humanities and from education sciences to bring anti-racism literacy to our classrooms, to our, our research communities in the sciences and medicine. And I will finish with a slide, just really recognizing the incredible moment that we're in the earth and in the geosciences and the environmental sciences, where we've got a huge group of community-driven, mostly early career-led organizations that are building bridges with each other and really using their collective power to push our disciplines in new ways, which I think is really exciting. And I want to recognize that we should, celebrate this work. We should value it. We should compensate it. We should definitely not expect that early career researchers, especially those in groups that we're already seeing, are experiencing disproportionate burdens on our disciplines, right? It's not their job to do this work. It's our job, but we should recognize when they're doing and think about ways that we can support them. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and open it up for any questions and discussion.
I'll start with a question, Erika.
Right.
I guess, you talked about ways to change how we value excellence. Have you started that conversation in your own department, or know other people who have? And is it getting all the way into the sort of promotion materials, or what does it look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Anna. And we're having that conversation at the departmental level, and some of it driven by changing demographics of our departments, which is exciting, but also by conversations that are happening at the university level, where, recognizing that, there's an important place in scholarship for community engaged research, right? And that community engaged research looks really different from the research where I can go out and dig soil, bring it to the lab and do whatever I want to it, right? And I don't have to build those relationships with people, right? I don't have to bring in the social component, right? Which takes time, right? You might not have, if you're, I know the University of Minnesota has like a huge history of working with tribal communities, right? You need to develop those relationships. You might not have access to the field sites that you would like to have access to collect the samples and the data that you want when you want it. But, that those research partners are really important. So how do we provide space for that type of work, right? Like we need to have, right? The metrics that we typically use for, traditional research, right? Not traditional indigenous science, but have to differ, right? Because the process is different. So that's something that I know that especially like the social sciences divisional committee at our university, in their tenure guidelines, have language about thinking about community engaged scholarship, and maybe those research publications, don't look right, like are not in a peer-reviewed like journal. Like maybe you have one of them, but maybe it's more valuable to have your scholarship output be something that the community can use, right? And like, how do we value that, right? And extension, of course, with extension, I think there is there is more of a kind of recognition of that type of work, right? Like, and how important that is, but it hasn't been that valued in other, in kind of other areas. So yeah, so those conversations are happening. And then also like, in addition to that, like, how do we recognize the effort that people and the labor that people put into doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And social justice work, mentoring students, things like that. Like that should be part of our, part of our work, right? And it should be valued as part of our work, and it should be part of our promotion evaluations. Yeah, but we've got some ways to go for sure.
I have a question. Hey, Erika, thanks for the talk. I do polar science and a lot of work in Antarctica, where we have a somewhat unique situation of having dozens of different sort of cultural communities come together, from scientists to science planners, the military, and folks from across professions across the spectrum that run our support system. And so have historically been throwing students into that with no real thought and consideration, which we're trying to do better in light of the report you probably saw on harassment in the U.S. Antarctic program. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts on approaches to tackle making progress on the issues that you've presented, where we have so many different organizations that need to evaluate that or value the work on that change, like NSF, who funds me, the university, the department, societies. I mean, there's so many things that need to change all at once. It seems overwhelming.
Absolutely, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you brought that up, because it definitely gets complicated. And then when you bring in people from other countries, right, and you've got different laws, right? I mean, different universities have different policies, if they even have policies. But yeah, it can get pretty complicated. And I think one of the research shows that the role of leadership is really important in kind of setting the expectations for climate and setting the culture. And so trying to get as much as you can, try to get the leadership of all those different organizations, all those different research teams. We've done our bystander intervention workshops. We also do kind of codes of conduct workshops, and we've done them in kind of similar environments, where you might have like people funded by NASA and like, Department of Energy and NSF from different organizations, different countries at a field site, right? Not necessarily Antarctica, but at a field site. And, and the first, right, a lot of people are like, oh, but my university has different rules. So it's like, well, set your code of conduct, right? Like the field stations should have a code of conduct, like the leadership should be, part of it. And yes, you have contractors, but you should have expectations for contractors too, right? And if you break the expectations, there's got to be consequences. And how do you build in consequences that are not punitive for the people who are being harmed, right? I know, sometimes in field environments, if somebody's sexually harassed, that they would just send that person home, which maybe if they want to go home, but maybe they don't want to go home, right? They lose out on kind of like the field experience. So really thinking about, kind of really have it like centered on the people who are disproportionately impacted, but having some consequences. If you're working with contractors and they are, you know, consistently contributing to hostile climate. I know sometimes in places like Antarctica, you don't always have that many choices of different contractors to go with, but that's where NSF should really step in and be like, you know what, we're going to stop funding these groups that are contributing that. So yeah, I think that's where coming together and kind of coming up with your own rules and having leadership committed to it is really important. Oh yeah, good question, Nancy. Yeah, that is the national climate right now is definitely a, yeah, go ahead.
For the people in the room, I just
Oh
want
yeah,
to
sorry.
put this buzz. Here in Iowa, some proposed legislation has been in the news lately about pausing DEI efforts at 3 public Iowa universities. So what are your thoughts on dealing with this type of legislation?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any diplomatic thoughts on how to deal with this type of legislation. Yeah, there's kind of an onslaught of stuff going on right now that goes against kind of working towards like safety and inclusivity and equity and climate. You know, with like, you know, all the anti-transgender bills too at the same time, right? So yeah, I think we need to keep talking. Like, I'm really disappointed that a lot of universities haven't spoken out about this, right? And that we need to find ways to continue doing this work. And that, you know, at some point, I know that I follow someone on Twitter who does a lot of kind of advocacy for, you know, on transgender health and safety. And in some places, there has been pushback and some of the bills have been rolled back, right? Or not approved because people have been there testifying and you know, some of the senators, right, have also kind of gotten on board, you know, if they're not there protesting and kind of pushing back, then all of those would have passed, right? And so, you know, how do we reconcile that with, you know, our already like very busy jobs? But I know I would love to see kind of, you know, our scientific agents, our societies, our funding agencies really pushing back, and, you know, and the research community, academic community really pushing back too. Yeah.
Yeah, and just ironically, like the University of Iowa just had to pay out a large discrimination lawsuit. So it's like, this is costing the state and university money on discrimination topics. So all in like the same month. So anyway.
Yeah,
okay.
Frustrating. I hear you.
Yes.
I'm in Wisconsin, so I'm probably a little closer to Iowa than those of you in Minnesota are, hopefully. But yeah. Yeah, I'm curious what some of the, you know, if your department has been having conversations. I mean, Peter, obviously your research team probably has, right? Or kind of the Antarctic research community has, but I wonder, yeah, kind of what's happening there on the ground.
This stuff came up in the Urge pods we did last year, talking about climate in the field, especially. Someone else is going to say something I just overrode. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. And I mean, I guess I can speak from our sort of polar science setting. It's been interesting when, you know, we had this huge sexual harassment problem identified in the Antarctic program, and the response to it from the National Science Foundation initially was to take ownership of some of it, but then also to put a lot of work on us again without sort of clear follow-up, like, we will fund you to do better and to structure your teams better and to sort of harden your teams, because you're still going to be sending them into a broken culture at our research stations, because, you know, you can't fix a problem like we have down there in a year or two. It's sort of a decade scale problem of setting a new culture that's been, you know, resetting a culture that's been developing over, or has been set for 50 years. Yeah, so it's interesting to have that, and I guess it's important also to take that on and make sure that we're continuing to communicate to NSF. So like, we're doing this, what are you doing? You know, and checking in all of the time. So what we've done is, you know, make sure to, well, we always invite our program officers to our important workshops, but then we also make clear to them that we give them warning that we're going to ask you about this, and we have a session, a Q&A with you about this report. And so, you know, our glaciology community was the first to do that after the report. And it was the timing of that was July, the report came out, something like that. Our field season starts, you know, October, November, and there was no plan to communicate with the community in between that report and that first field season after the report. So we made sure in September, so like, well, you're coming to our workshop and we're going to set aside an hour to talk to this. So they they scrambled and prepared to respond.
Yeah, that's good. We need to keep pushing. I mean, a lot of the change that we're seeing from funding agencies is because the community is asking for it. Yeah. And for societies too, right? It's because the community is asking for it. Yeah.
I guess I can just say one thing about the department. Can you hear me? Or not?
Yeah, I can. Thanks.
Yeah, so all of what you said is on our radar. I'm the department head. So we have a very active DEI committee. And I guess our biggest push is for recruiting and trying to increase diversity in the department. And a lot of times it takes money and funds and things like that to do that, especially if you're going to be recruiting faculty. So I don't know, it's a long-term process, but everything that you said is on our radar. I guess that's
Good.
But and thank you for the presentation. It's really good.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, yeah, this is stuff that is not, you know, the data is new, the recommendations are not original, but they need to keep repeated, right? And we need to keep thinking about, okay, how do we do this? Let's talk it through. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, I appreciate all of you here and listening. You know, if anybody has any kind of follow-up questions, like feel free to send me an email. Always happy to kind of have more conversations about this, and always curious about what other departments are doing, because I learned about what to do in my place too. So yeah, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon. And thanks so much for the invitation, Anna.
Thanks, Erika, for collecting and publishing the data that sort of gives us starting point and, you know, keeps everything moving.
Yeah,
Really valuable.
yeah, great. Well, thank you all. Take care.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.